and then we'll get into 5, hopefully. So remember I said that Deuteronomy 4 is in some ways a preface to the 10 Commandments, or as the Hebrew Bible refers to them, the 10 words. And so it's kind of laying the groundwork. So a couple things about that. Remember I said that we want to remember that, first of all, that the land is considered a covenant blessing. And therefore, Israel's disobedience to the covenant could cause that blessing to be temporarily withdrawn, as it in fact was in 586 BC with the Babylonian invasion. And then also said something about why idolatry is so significant in the Old Testament. And that's because, as I tried to point out, right, that God is so alive that he can't really be captured by any sort of humanly created thing. And this, by the way, would mean also, right, you can be an idolater without having an idol around, right? You can have an idol up in here, okay? So you can be a mental idolater as well as a physical idolater. And what idolatry really boils down to is the sort of the general kind of human thinking, right, that says, you know, God should be like, and then we start to fill in the blanks. Okay, so the idea here behind Israel's rejection of idolatry, or the law's rejection of idolatry, is that we have to allow God to be who he is. And if we're going to know the truth about him, he's going to have to reveal it to us. It's not left to us to decide, you know, well, I think that God should be like X, Y, or Z. So that's the importance of more about idolatry in just a few minutes. Now, there's one other thing we want to take a look at before we move into Deuteronomy 5, and that's this. In Deuteronomy 4:19, we have a really important saying from Moses, which actually relates directly to our reading from Romans this morning, and that's why I want to underline it. So, in the context of talking about idolatry, Moses says this to the people of Israel: "And beware, lest you raise your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun and the moon and the stars and the host of heaven, you be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them, things that the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under heaven." That is, notice what Moses is saying here, and Paul picks up the thread. What tends to happen with idolatry, right, is people sort of look around themselves, and what they do is they latch on to part of creation and then identify God with that thing, right? So the people of Israel are going into the land of Canaan, and they're going to be among people who do worship the sun and the stars and the moon and various forces of nature like fertility and rain and things like that, right? So what they've done is they've kind of latched on to some feature of creation and decided, okay, this thing is really, really important. It must be God. So that's what Moses is warning against. Paul then picks up the theme in Romans 1 and kind of runs with it a little bit further. Now, here's a word of warning. This is a general word of warning about the covenant, and we'll see more about this in just a minute. Take care. This is Deuteronomy 4:23. Take care lest you forget the covenant of the Lord your God, which he made with you, and make a carved image, the form of anything that the Lord your God has forbidden you. For the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. So let me say a word about both those phrases: consuming fire and jealous God. Now, some people think that, you know, the New Testament and the Old Testament are somehow like really different, and that in the Old Testament God's like mean, and then God like underwent like a personality change in the New Testament and became like nice. Well, as witness against that idea, listen to Hebrews, letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament, chapter 12, verses 28 to 29. Excuse me, verses 26 to 20. I need to look at my trifocals here. So this is Paul letting the people know what they've arrived at, which is kind of like a new Mount Sinai. This is what he says. At the time, his voice shook the earth. It is when God appeared to Israel on Mount Sinai. At the time, his voice shook the earth, and he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only earth, but also the heavens. This phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of things that are shaken. That is, that have been made in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And let us therefore offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. The very phrase that Moses uses here in Deuteronomy 4. What's being said there? What's being communicated with the idea of God as a consuming fire? Well, I think it's a very visual image, right? And the idea here is fire here is a way of thinking about the holiness of God. So think about fire, right, as being used in the refinement of metal, right? You have some metal and you need to get the impurities out of it. So what do? You melt it down, and the impurities are removed. The idea right here is God's holiness is such that God, in effect, consumes or burns out the impurities from his people. Okay? Now, one of the things that follows from that, right, is this. Will it be fun having your impurities removed? No. Okay, that's the point, right? Having your impurities removed will not necessarily be a pleasant experience, but it has to happen. Okay? It has to happen. So the idea is God's holiness is a refining fire that removes the impurities from his people, and that's actually good. Okay? So, and then the second phrase describes God as being jealous. What does that mean? Now, in English, right, jealous has sort of like a negative connotation, right? It sounds something that's kind of bad. But here it actually means something very good, and it means something like this. God's going to make a covenant with the people of Israel. And that covenant is going to look very much like a marriage relationship. As a matter of fact, it's pictured as such in the book of the prophet Hosea. And therefore, right, God's covenant with the people of Israel is an exclusive covenant. They are to worship and serve God and God alone, and not other gods. So imagine the Old Testament story being told in a slightly different way to sort of get what jealousy might mean here. So let's say that the people of Israel are at Mount Sinai, and they do what we saw they did back in Exodus, right? They make for themselves a golden calf and begin to worship it. And God says to them, oh, that calf is really nice. You did a really good job making it. It shows that you're really creative and you've got a vivid religious imagination. I think this is a really good thing. Continue to worship it because, it doesn't really bother me. The way that I like to illustrate jealousy here in the good way, right, is let's say, it's getting on toward maybe 5:30 or 6 o'clock, and I call my wife at home and I say, Sarah, I'm going to be late tonight because I've got a date with Judy this evening. And Sarah says to me, oh, okay, hope you have a good time. And that's it. Now, if she says that, right, what does that say about how she understands our marriage? She doesn't really have a very high view of it, right? Now, of course, in reality, what would happen if I made that phone call? Within 10 minutes, she'd be out in the parking lot with a baseball bat. Okay? And that's the point here, right? Is that God, because he is God, he and he alone can demand this kind of total, absolute loyalty from his creatures No other thing can make that demand, right? No government can make that demand. No person can make that demand. No ruler, no cause. Nothing can make that kind of absolute demand. Only God. So that's what's being communicated here, right? God expects exclusive loyalty and service, and we'll see here in just a minute when we get to Deuteronomy 6, right, that'll be spelled out, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is the only God. Therefore, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your strength, nothing held back. That's the idea, okay? Finally, one final thing here, and that's this. This is towards the end of Deuteronomy 4. This is sort of like a confessional statement. This is Deuteronomy 4:39. Moses once again reminding the people. So once again, remember, they're about to cross into Palestine, Canaan, where there's a fairly advanced civilization. People worship all manner of gods and goddesses. There are all these elaborate temples and things like that. And this is Moses' word of warning to them. Know therefore today, and lay it to your heart, that the Lord is God in heaven above, and on the earth beneath, there is no other. Notice what Moses pointed. The Lord is God in heaven above. He's also God on earth below. There isn't another one. This is it. So now, right, this actually helps us understand why idolatry is so serious, okay? It's not just that people are like worshiping physical objects, or they've ended up with maybe like a slightly wrong concept of God. Rather, one of the basic principles of the Old Testament is this: we become like what we worship. We become like what we worship. So what happens when we worship that which is false? We become false. And that's why this commandment here is so important, okay? Take it to heart. The Lord your God is the only God. He's the only real God. He's the real creator. And so worshiping him, right, is actually going to be a benefit to you. Because by centering your lives on the truth, capital T, your sort of sin-stained hearts and minds are going to be rehabilitated. And that's a really important thing here, right? God doesn't need our worship. God doesn't need anything from us, right? That's one of the most important things we need to recognize in terms of our relationship with God. God doesn't need us. That's why he's the creator and we're the creatures. So, right, whatever God does, whatever God tells us, right, is not because somehow he's trying to sort of like manipulate something out of us, because he doesn't need anything from us. Rather, our relationship with God is totally asymmetric. God needs nothing from us. We need everything from him. That's how things stand. Okay, well, let's take a look now at Deuteronomy 5. So in Deuteronomy 5, we get Deuteronomy's version of the 10 words. So we'll walk through them. And then what we'll find is Deuteronomy 12 through 26 offers the second law, or the second Torah, that we saw back in Exodus and Leviticus. And that's why the book of Deuteronomy acquired the name Deuteronomy. Deutero meaning second. The last word comes from the Greek word nomos, literally second law. Deuteronomy, second law. So let's take a look at the 10 words. Let me preface them by saying just one thing about them. It's really, really important, I think, that we understand that the 10 words are not being given to Israel as almost like a test. It's not like God is sort of saying, okay, I'm going to unload 10 really, really difficult things on the people of Israel, and I'll see how they do with them. Right? This is not like, some kind of semi-sadistic teacher thinking up the hardest possible assignment that they can. Actually, it's quite the opposite. The purpose of the 10 words is to reintroduce order into a creation that has been disordered by sin. Okay, so the law here actually is a blessing. Okay, the purpose of the law, the Torah, is to begin to reintroduce order in a creation that's been disordered by human sin. And that order has a particular shape. So we want to notice this. What does order look like? Well, it looks like basically two things. Order consists in two basic things. Order consists in human beings being properly related to God, part one. Order consists also in human beings being properly related to one another, part two. Okay? So remember in the Gospel of Matthew, when the clever sort of lawyer comes up to Jesus and says, "Oh, Rabbi, got a little question for you. What's the greatest commandment?" Okay, what's the one commandment that's like really, really, really important that we all need to keep, and please, make it not difficult? And Jesus says, "Oh, well, that's easy. It's this. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself." And that's where the lawyer goes, wait a minute. I only asked for one. You just gave me two. Well, no, actually, Jesus did give him one because the two can't be separated, right? You can't, we're not given a choice of loving God or loving our neighbor. You don't get that choice, okay? You can't claim to love God if you don't love your neighbor. Okay, this doesn't work like that. Okay, so we just want to remember here that the purpose of law here is to introduce order into chaos and to properly orient people toward God and also to properly orient people to one another. So let's take a look at how this unfolds. And Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, "Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the rules that I speak in your hearing today, and you shall learn them and be careful to do them. The Lord your God made a covenant with us at Horeb. Not with our fathers did the Lord God make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us alive today. The Lord spoke face to face on the mountain out of the midst of fire, while I stood between the Lord and you at that time to declare to you the word of the Lord, for you were afraid because of the fire, and you did not go up onto the mountain." Notice what Moses says here. This is important. Moses says, look, this covenant wasn't simply made with the people who were physically at Mount Sinai. The covenant was also made with you. Now this tells us something really, really important, right? It tells us that the people of Israel are to think of themselves as actually having been present at Mount Sinai when the covenant was made. Okay? The equivalent in Christianity, of course, is the Eucharist, during which we're all present in the upper room when the new covenant is made. Right? So that's the idea. So the making of the covenant on Mount Sinai wasn't just simply like a past event. Every generation is to understand itself as having been present at Mount Sinai and seen God up on the mountain. And then Moses says this, I stood between the Lord and you because you were afraid to come near the mountain. And who wouldn't have been afraid, right? Smoke, thunder, the mountain wrapped in clouds, earthquake, lightning, the whole 9 yards, right? Who wouldn't have been terrified? But notice this is important for later on. Notice Moses' role. Moses here is kind of a mediator between God and the people. A role, of course, that will soon be filled in its archetypal way by Christ. Okay, that is the mediator between God and human beings. So Moses is sort of like the prefiguration of Christ in this respect. Now, here's the first commandment. This is Deuteronomy 5:6. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. So notice this. This is really important. Notice here that God doesn't say, okay, folks, Here are the rules, and you'd better keep them because I'm watching. This is what God says. Look, I'm the Lord your God, and I graciously, faithfully delivered you from slavery in Egypt. You didn't deserve to be delivered. You didn't even ask to be delivered. As a matter of fact, the moment you were across the Red Sea, you complained. But I graciously delivered you. I did something for you that you didn't deserve. And now, here's how I want you to respond to me. This is really important, okay? How is Israel to respond to this gracious act of deliverance? That's what the 10 words are about, okay? Here's how you live into that response. And here's why I say I think that it's really important to understand the 10 words here in many ways as being Israel's marriage vows. Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, in sickness and in health, till death do you part? Now, if the man says, do I have to? That tells you something's wrong. Okay? That tells you that either, the premarital counseling might have been inadequate, or he's just dumb and doesn't understand what's going on, or both. But the idea here is, okay, Israel, I'm inviting you into a covenant with me. Here are your wedding vows. Okay? Wedding vow number 1, you shall have no other gods before me. Right? I am the sole object of your loyalty and faithfulness. Okay, so really important. It's really important to notice here what's going on. God is not simply asking the people to sort of like believe things about him. Okay, he is asking that, but he's asking for more of this. God isn't just saying, from Mount Sinai, okay, folks, we're going to take a little theological test here. Want to show of hands. All of you who believe that I'm omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent, raise your hands. And everybody in Israel raises their hand, and God says, okay, good, you all passed the test. You all get a passing grade. Wonderful. No. What God wants from his people, right, isn't just simply that they believe things about him. What he wants from them is their faithfulness, their loyalty. And that's important. Okay? Once again, right, it's not, to go back to the wedding vow, right, the wedding vow isn't, do you think of this woman as your lawfully wedded wife? Are you willing to conceive her in this way? That's what you're being asked, right? To have and to hold, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, in sickness and health, and forsaking all others, be faithful to her as long as you both shall live. Right? You're being asked to do something. Okay, so that's what's being asked here. So God here is the ultimate object of Israel's trust, loyalty, faithfulness. That's the first commandment, right? And in some ways, right, that summarizes the whole of the law. Because if you don't do this, right, you're not going to do the rest of it. It'll fall apart. So second commandment, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven or that is on the earth or beneath the earth or the water that is under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers and the children to the third and fourth generation, and of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me. So, really important point here. So, we have exclusive loyalty, and now we have another commandment, right, that sort of basically forbids Israel to sort of do what all the people around her are doing, and that is sort of invent images of God for themselves. Well, I think that God is 6.5 feet tall, has broad shoulders, enormous biceps, blonde hair, and a mustache. When I think of God, that's what I think of. And that's where all of you are supposed to say, you know what, Michael? You've lost your mind. Okay, we're not listening to you anymore. So Israel's forbidden. And notice this. I think there's a really important word here in Deuteronomy 5:10. Steadfast love. Really important Old Testament concept. So here it is. This is actually one Hebrew word. There's actually no English word that's equivalent, so we have to kind of invent two words to sort of describe it. Steadfast love. Or you might want to translate it like this: covenant-loving faithfulness. God practices covenant-loving faithfulness, meaning, right, that having made a covenant with his people, have made a covenant with the people of Israel, God is not going to the people of Israel. God is not going to, this is not a contract. This is not, there's not a point where Israel reaches a point where saying, you know what? We've decided, our covenant committee had a meeting last night, and they decided that we don't want to be your covenant people anymore because this is too darn difficult. So we're calling for the end of our covenant relationship with you. Can't do it. Right? God makes the covenant, and that covenant doesn't come to an end until God decides it comes to an end, and God decided it's not going to come to an end, which is actually good. Right? Because that means God's not going to abandon us. So this idea of steadfast love is really important. And then 5:11, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Now, there's a lot here, and if you want more on this, there's a wonderful exposition of this in the ACNA Catechism, to be a Christian. The third part of the Catechism is a teaching on the Ten Commandments. So if you want more on this, I'll point in that direction. But let's just say one thing about this. Notice what's going on here. God's name here actually refers to himself. So remember in Exodus 3, God reveals his personal name to Moses, which we're not sure how to pronounce. And so most English Bibles, whenever you see the word Lord, capital O, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, that means that God's proper name was there in the Hebrew text, but it's been substituted for this word, because God's name is so holy that it's not spoken. So when you talk about God's name, right, you're talking about God himself. And so here's this, right? What does it mean to take God's name in vain? Well, it means a number of things, but probably the most massive and the most important is this. God's people bear his name. They're his people. They take his name in vain whenever, by the way that they live, they suggest that somehow God is less than great and grand and glorious. So notice what that means, right? We take God's name in vain whenever we somehow act or speak as if God were not somehow the most important thing in the whole universe. When we kind of live lives that are kind of like semi-trivial, when we kind of lapse into kind of religious laziness, well, I know it's Sunday, but I have had a difficult weekend, so I'm going to sleep in. Or, yeah, I realize, this is my normal prayer time, but I'm going to skip it today. Or like we say things or do things that somehow, right, suggest that we're actually not the people of God. When we do those things, we basically take God's name in vain. We, in effect, trivialize God. So I think it's really important to see the seriousness of this. Here's another way to think about this. One of the things that God wants to do with the people of Israel, but also with us, right, is God wants us to be, in effect, kind of like living, walking, talking advertisements for him. By what we say, by what we do, by what we don't say, and by what we don't do. God wants us to kind of be like his visible, living, walking, talking advertisements. So we can either be like advertisements for him or advertisements against him. Almost along the lines of, gosh, if that's how God's people live, I don't want any part of it. Right? If that's what Christianity is, no thank you. Okay, so we've been given a really important vocation that we really need to live into it. One final thing, this is the fourth commandment about the Sabbath. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall do no work, neither you, nor son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, your ox, your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gate. So this is really spelled out clearly. So, right, the Sabbath is an institution that's established by God. It's not just like a day of the week. The Sabbath is an institution that's created by God. And it applies to everything and everyone. So in the land of Israel, right, it doesn't matter who. It might be your servant, your female servant, your male servant, your son, your daughter working in the fields. It even applies to the non-resident alien, the kind of the foreigner who's temporarily working in Israel. The Sabbath even applies to them. Right? You cannot require any person or any animal to work in the Sabbath. It is a day of rest, and the reason for that is this, right? Well, there are a couple of reasons, but probably the most important reason is this. The Sabbath, as a day of rest, is a sign of the peace or the shalom that God intends for his whole creation. And it's also a sign, right? It's also an act of trust. We want to remember, right? So far as we know, that only the people of Israel in the whole of the ancient world were the only people that actually observed the Sabbath. Everyone else, sun up to sundown, 7 days a week, it's work. The Sabbath rite is, in effect, an act of faith in God because, in effect, you're going to say, right, on this day, I'm going to do no work. And I believe, right, that because God's the creator, we can trust that there'll still be enough, even if we have a day of non-work. The world, that's probably not true. And so here we have the Sabbath rite as a gift. So one of my favorite G.K. Chesterton quotes is from his book, Orthodoxy, right? A holy day for God becomes a holiday for people. A holy day for God becomes a holiday for people. Okay, we'll continue with the fifth commandment about honoring your father and mother next Sunday.